Morning, everyone. We're going to get started soon. We're so glad you can join us today. While we're waiting for everyone else to log on, we always ask people if you'd like to type into the chat where you're logging in from. We always love to see the different areas where people are coming from and joining us. Hi, John. First person, Blacksburg, Virginia. And Annabelle and Sterling, welcome. Lily from Charlottesville. Milton, Georgia. Welcome, Winston. Roanoke. So glad for everybody to be here. Smithsonian Front Royal, welcome. One of our community partners that we value very much. Tacoma Park, Maryland. Love seeing everyone. Again, I'm Rowena Zimmerman and from Blue Ridge PRISM, and we are just waiting for everyone to give everyone the chance to log on before we get started. And while we're waiting, everyone is just kind of typing in where they live. Hello, Springfield, Virginia. Good morning, Kim Owens in Williamsburg, Virginia. My daughter's at school there right now. I hope it's a pretty day. It's a pretty day there. Catherine, I saw that, Frederick, I saw that you raised your hand. If you want to just go ahead and type a question into the chat, we're happy to answer. Hello, Julie from Bloomfield, Connecticut. Hi again, this is Rowena Zimmerman from Blue Ridge PRISM, and we are just giving people just a few minutes to log in to the webinar, and we'll get started shortly. Catherine from Trenton, New Jersey, welcome. I'm from Northern New Jersey. Nice to see you. Cold and windy, really, in Williamsburg. I was just there this weekend, and it was really hot. So it was so hot. It was enervating. I was exhausted when I got home. It was parents' weekend, so I was there. Always happy to see Charlottesville represented. You had a frost warning in Williamsburg. That is crazy because it was like 90 degrees on Saturday. It was so hot. Once again, just wanted to welcome everyone, and we are going to start in just a minute. We just wanted to give everyone a chance to log into the webinar before we get started. I know, I agree. It's been the weirdest weather week. I don't even know what to expect in 2 days. Is it going to like warm up, or is it going to stay cold? It was so windy this morning. I thought that I'd wake up and there'd be no leaves on the trees, but I was happy to see there are still some. So West Virginia.
I think we probably can get started. It seems like most people have gotten logged in.
Got a good number. So I just want to welcome you. My name is Rowena Zimmerman, and I'm the Director of Communications and Outreach at Blue Ridge PRISM. And we're so happy you could join us here today for our fall quarterly meeting. Joining me are Elizabeth Meisel, who is our Executive Director, and who's going to do a little update for you on PRISM in just a second. And then, of course, our speaker, John Scrivani from the American Chestnut Society. So right now, I'm going to hand it over to Beth.
Thanks, Rowena, and hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to have John here talking about the restoring the American chestnut. Just a few items to cover before we really dig into the topic and hear John's presentation. First, if you're having some audio issues, you can take a look at some of the instructions, but really go to your little microphone in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. and you can adjust your settings there. And if you're having problems and you still can't hear us, it seems to be less of a problem these days. You can always leave the webinar and try to come back in. That sometimes resolves it. I just wanted to announce a few upcoming events that I think are really important. On November the 16th, there is an event. It is not being hosted by Blue Ridge PRISM, but our partner at Nature Forward. And they're going to host a writer and humane gardener founder Nancy Lawson as she hosts a panel discussion among leading experts who have been on the front lines of advocating in Maryland and Virginia for allowing low impact native habitat landscaping in common interest communities such as homeowner associations. So we expect that there's going to be a push this year to help some of the laws to make it easier for folks in HOAs and everywhere to support wildlife friendly gardens. So definitely plan on checking out Nature Forward's event. The link is here on the screen, or if you go to Nature Forward's website, they have all the registration details there. But this is a really exciting event, so I wanted to make sure to share that with our community, because native plants and using native plants in conservation landscaping is one of the key ways we can prevent new introductions of invasive plants that might come from landscaping plants. So on November 28th, I would just like to highlight that we're gearing up for Giving Tuesday. And so I encourage you to follow our social media fundraising blitz to support our PRISM programs. And I encourage you to release your radical generosity, either with PRISM or your favorite conservation organization. But, you know, we would really love your support here at PRISM. And then lastly, I wanted to announce a workshop that Blue Ridge PRISM is hosting in December. This is a future search workshop, and where the intent is to identify and launch a series of new statewide initiatives and action plans that make dramatic progress against invasive plants and support the use of native plants. So this workshop is by invitation only, so I hope I didn't get you too excited about wanting to join us, but we need a handful of volunteers to help support this 3-day event. So if you are interested, if you're in the Charlottesville area, please get in touch with us, info@blueridgeprism.org. We probably need about 5 to 6 additional volunteers to help out on different activities throughout the 3 days. So please reach out to me and let me know if you're interested in volunteering for this event. Hold on a second, I'm having some issues with my presentation. I am so sorry. Hold on, folks. Something just went wackadoo. Okay, I think you can see that. Just some Zoom tips for the day. Please direct your questions to the Q&A box and use the chat. We'll try to drop in relevant links throughout John's presentation today. We're going to skip the raised hand function since we have such a large audience. So if you do have a question, please direct it to the Q&A. Lastly, we've allowed plenty of time for questions today, but if you think of something afterwards or not sure, send us an email, info@blueridgeprism.org, or send us a message through Facebook. And then lastly, I would just like to highlight that we are kicking off our end of year fundraising to support Blue Ridge PRISM. And as part of that, we were able to receive another challenge grant from the Virginia Environmental Endowment. So contributions made beginning October 1st up to throughout the end of the year until we hit $20,000 will be matched 1-to-1. So if you're considering an end of year gift to Blue Ridge PRISM, now is a great time to do that because your gift will be doubled. You can visit our website to make a contribution, and we would just like to thank you for your continued support. So with that, I am going to turn the meeting over to Rowena.
Hello again, and thank you, Beth. I wanted to first talk about the drawing that we advertised on social media, that we have several chestnut seedlings that have been grown in the nursery on Middle Mountain Farm, which is the farm owned by our president, Rod Walker, in Free Union. And we have gone ahead and made the drawing for the 2 free chestnuts for several people. And we'll let you know, we'll email you, just so you know, you need to come to Charlottesville to pick them up. We cannot ship those. So if that's an issue, just let us know. If we contact you, and we can just pick the next person. Don't worry about that. But you will receive an email from us if you did win these free chestnut seedlings. So moving on to John, I want to just tell you a little about him. John Scrivani received his PhD in forest management from Oregon State University in 1985. After teaching forestry at Virginia Tech for 4 years, John took a research forester position with the Virginia Department of Forestry, where he managed field research, pine breeding, and forest inventory. John joined the Ivy Creek Board of Directors in 1998 and served as president in 2000 and 2001. He has led the efforts to establish the warm season grass fields and helped conduct the first prescribed burns at Ivy Creek. John retired in 2017 to teach part-time at the University of Richmond and to devote his volunteer efforts towards ecologic restoration with both the American Chestnut Foundation and the Ivy Creek Foundation. He is currently the president of the Virginia chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation. So with that, John, I'd like to welcome you, and I will mute myself. And
thank you, Rowena. Let me see if I can successfully share the screen. Are you seeing only the screen at the moment, the projected?
Yep, there you go. It looks good.
Okay, great. Right. Well, thank you all for letting me talk to you about my favorite topic, a highlight of my career, so much that I continued it in retirement. And this first slide right here actually is one of my favorite places in the world. It's Lasagne State Forest in Nelson County, and it has a lot of history in this photo. So in the background are the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the Blue Ridge Mountains were the region of the eastern United States where chestnut truly was dominant, where it clearly, in many areas, had 25% or more of the forest habitat, dominant trees in the forest canopy before the blight was introduced. In the midground is an area which is actually in bloom. It may be a little hard to tell, but there are white flowers in those trees in June. And that's actually a 10-acre planting that was put in starting in 1968 from trees from the Connecticut Ag Experiment Station. And those were hybrid trees, a mix of American and Chinese and Japanese hybrids that now form a solid stand that's average height about 65 to 70 feet tall, solid stand of chestnuts. In the foreground are advanced breeding generations where we took those hybrids and back-crossed them with Americans to create trees that were 3/4, 7/8, and 15/16 American in heritage. And we do that and continue to do that by controlled pollinations, which is what you see in the foreground. Those white bags on the trees are the bags on the female flowers awaiting pollination from the fathers that we designated to collect pollen from and control the cross. So this is telling a good bit of the story of how we've gone about trying to restore the American chestnut, but let me talk a little bit about why. First, the American chestnut, Castanea dentata, is a dominant forest tree. It's a very distinctive. A lot of people have trouble distinguishing it from Chinese chestnuts, which have very similar burrs and somewhat similar leaves. The most distinctive part visually is both the canoe shape of this leaf, tapered at both ends, although there's a lot of variation. So I often just to make sure I look for some leaves that have this canoe shape. Don't eliminate it as an American just because some of the leaf bases are rounded. But the teeth that form kind of a breaking wave is very distinctive, where the Chinese chestnuts have shorter bristle teeth that kind of come out at more like triangles rather than this curved forward. But both species have spiny burrs, typically with 3 nuts in them. They have flowers in June, which are mostly what you're seeing here are the male. They're bisexual flowers. There's the male pollen producing flowers are on the long catkins. And then at the base of some of the other catkins are smaller female flowers. Actually not smaller flowers, but small flowers at the base of the behind, somewhat developmentally behind catkins. It's a tall tree. So it was a dominant canopy tree in Eastern North America. This is actually only about 120-year-old tree growing in an arboretum in Belgium. And it reached over 120 foot high in those 120 years. Pretty much close to 4 foot in diameter. And this is typical, I think, of growth on much of the east in the Appalachians before the blight came through. It was most dominant in the Appalachian Mountains, but also extended into eastern forest regions from the Piedmont and somewhat into the coastal plain from Virginia to Maine, further south into the coastal plain, and further west into Ohio and Indiana, and up to almost to Michigan. We like to call it a foundational species or a foundation species because it produced a lot of, it set the stage for a lot of the rest of the trees and animals and plants and the ecosystems in which it grew in several ways. It grew a lot of wood, dominated the canopy. It produced a lot of mast, the chestnuts, and it was both prolific, but also consistent from year to year, unlike oaks and hickories. So it's estimated in the Appalachian forest, they probably produced on average about 30% of the hard mast in the fall. But in bust years for oak and hickories, it produced up to 80% of the mast. So it was more reliable than oak and hickory for wildlife and for people. It also has pyrophilic leaves, meaning they burn easily, and vigorous sprouting. Both are indications of fire adaptability, and that they probably help foster low intensity ground fires, and they were able to respond to those fires by vigorously sprouting if the top was killed back. It is kind of unique among eastern forest trees in that it's both shade tolerant. So seedlings will survive for a long time in the understory, but they're also capable of rapid growth when released from shade. So they can hang around in the canopy, in the understory as seedlings for many, many years, even decades, and build up root reserves. And then when there's a disturbance, either from fire or logging or wind, they can rapidly grow and attain canopy status. When they start growing, when they're released from shade and have full sun, they're very fast. They're competitive with oak, generally most oak trees, even with northern red oak, which is technically the fastest growing oak around here, and tulip trees. Even in the coves, we're not dominant in Appalachian coves, but they could compete, hold their own with the tulip trees that really dominated those coves. They are drought resistant. They preferred and did best on the side slopes that were well drained, acidic. They do not like limestone soils. You'll find them on limestone soils, but they tend not to do well. And on mesic to xeric sites, mesic meaning intermediate in moisture, not too wet, not too dry, but they also do quite well on the drier sites. They do like well-drained soil. They don't like getting their feet wet, and that's true even before one of the introduced species, which is definitely a problem in wet areas, but it's even more so now. They grew as tall and big around as any of the oaks or tulip trees. Some people tend to exaggerate them. A lot of people call them the redwoods of the East. And there's one element of truth to that, is the wood is very rot resistant, like redwoods, but they weren't necessarily any taller than other tall or any bigger than other tall dominant trees like oaks and tulip poplars and hemlocks and so on, white pines. So as a foundation species, it was a dominant primary producer, a large canopy tree that in many places was up to 25% of the trees on county levels. Certain stands would be 50 to 100%. It was prolific and consistent producer of hard mass, as I mentioned. They provide, of course, the chestnuts provide food for rodents, deer, bear, birds, and people. As I mentioned, it was fire adapted. It also has some indication that it produces allelopathic chemicals and you can tell this if you have big piles of chestnut burrs, because nothing will grow underneath or around them. And that was hypothesized to help limit rhododendron in mountain coves. That's actually one thing that people have noticed in historical accounts of mountain coves, that they were much more open, not dominated as much by rhododendron as they tend to be now. And some people attribute this to the loss of the chestnut. They also have a high carbon nitrogen ratio in their leaves, so the leaf litter tended to produce more productivity in trout and stream and vertebrates. Several of the many ecological functions that the species provided. So chestnut in general just supported a forest that was more productive, stable, and diverse than today's forest, and produced a lot of nice trees. But they also gave a lot to both people and wildlife. So it's a great source of food for wildlife. It was also a source of food for indigenous Americans before colonial, and then became a very important food source for Appalachian people, particularly as a cash crop they could collect and send to the cities, particularly around after they were collected in the fall. They would be sent to the cities and sold on the street on open fires. That's the famous song, "Chestnuts Roasting on Open Fire." The wood was also, as I said, rot resistant. It was also very easy to work. So it was used to build barns and houses, cabins, split rail fences, and for many years, a very important economic contribution was the ability to extract tannins from both the bark and the wood that was used to tan leather. And it was actually, there were many tannin mills across the Appalachians that provided a big economic return from chestnut bark and wood tannin. So the Native Americans were known to be active and passive promoters of mast and fruit trees in the eastern U.S. The land use practices had a profound effect on promoting mast and fruit trees, but also on the historic development of the eastern oak and pine forests, and then the savannas and tallgrass prairies as well. The most important mast producers were oak, hickory, and chestnut. There's been a little trouble in getting good data to support this. And it was kind of underestimated, the role of chestnut in the past, because oak and hickory leave a lot of archaeological evidence. The nuts don't degrade. Chestnuts degrade. There's nothing really left of them after a few years. So there was not as much evidence of chestnut found in archaeological digs. So there was an emphasis on oak and hickory, which were very, very important, but chestnut might have been right up there with them. Native peoples regularly use fire and tree girdling to favor mast and fruit trees. And there's many descriptions in early times and by early Appalachian European settlers and Appalachians about chestnut groves. And these scattered throughout or chestnut orchards scattered throughout the mountains. And these may have been managed by the indigenous people before the European settlers settled in the Appalachians. And then they were maintained, often were fenced in by rock fences or wooden fences, and used by Appalachian settlers to raise their hogs, to fatten their hogs in the fall before slaughter. So otherwise, so this kind of active management of the forest by indigenous peoples kept oaks and chestnuts, oaks and hickories and chestnut as the dominant trees in the eastern forest. And the lack of the fire and this management by folks, either indigenous or the Appalachian settlers afterwards, have resulted in a more mesic, closed canopy forest with more shade tolerant, less fire resistant trees. And that has well known to be a problem for producing oak regeneration and hickory regeneration to a lesser extent. And we can only assume, we don't really know the history, but chestnut would probably have the same problem. So why is not chestnut still around? Well, it declined from 2 invasive exotic species. These were introduced first, the Phytophthora cinnamomi was introduced sometime in the 19th century, possibly even the 18th century. It's a root rot. It's an oomycete. Ink disease is a common name for it. And it produces, it infects the roots and can quickly degrade them. It was introduced from the tropics. It was first found on, or identified on, cinnamon trees, hence the species name. But it infects a lot of trees, and it's pretty widespread in areas of the U.S. that are warm enough, particularly in the eastern U.S., that are warm enough for it to survive the winter in the soil. And with climate change, it's moving further north. It's pretty common throughout the coastal plain in Piedmont of Virginia, and many places in the mountain. And sometime in the late 19th century, chestnut blight was introduced from Asia. Most likely suspects that brought them in were Japanese chestnuts, Triphanectaria parasitica, and it forms cankers on the bark, that eventually produce a toxic acid, oxalic acid, that eventually kills the xylem cambium and girdle of the trees. Fortunately, it doesn't kill the root system, so the roots continue to resprout. But it was introduced or first found in 1904 in New York City, and it quickly moved down the Appalachian chain and out through the whole range of American chestnut. So by 1950, it was all the way down to the northern Florida border, which there were a few remnant chestnut stands in there. So it was a large economic impact, the timber resources and the nut production that was a pretty important part of the Appalachian economy was devastated, particularly coming through Virginia and the Carolinas in the 30s and 40s. So in conjunction with the Great Depression. So it was a kind of a double whammy for the Appalachian people. Phytophthora cinnamomi, roughly 200 years ago, it came from the tropics and subtropics. It caused a slow chestnut decline in southern coastal plain and Piedmont populations. Moving north and up in elevation, it's going to probably be favored by climate change. And so let me go back to the slide of the distribution. This map of distribution was made in the 1970s from records, herbarium records. But there's pretty good evidence. You can see all these little isolated outposts of chestnuts in the coastal plain. The thinking is that it was actually through the coastal plain down even into the panhandle of Florida beforehand, but Phytophthora really reduced it. So when they made this map, they did not really have the evidence that it was that extensive in the coastal plain of the Southeast. So the chestnut blight, it's only kills the above ground stem, as I mentioned, but it also lives on oaks, usually with no impact. You can find it on many oaks, About the only evidence, if you see scarlet oaks that have big burls at the base, that is a reaction to the blight that scarlet oak tends to have. There are a few cases of it seriously impacting the health of live oak trees and maybe even killing them. But generally, oaks have no issue fighting off the blight and living with it. But chestnut most wild type chestnuts are American chestnuts are very susceptible and do not survive. There's also a couple of other invasive threats that have been introduced. The Asian chestnut gall wasp is not typically a lethal pest. It forms these galls on the leaves. It can interfere with nut production. And if there's a big enough population, it can more or less defoliate the tree and cause problems. It's more of a nuisance in orchards. It's less common in wild stands. Of course, there's not many dense wild stands in the native range anymore. But it needs to be managed in orchards because it reduces nut production and growth. We have ambrosia beetle, which can affect small stems of chestnuts. It's a problem in our breeding orchards often, and less of a problem in more natural stands. But it's an introduced beetle, and it has these telltale toothpick strands coming out of the bark. And there are some methods of controlling those. So we like to talk about the American chestnut as being functionally extinct. So the above ground stem is easily killed by the blight, but they'll resprout and they keep creating new sprouts. Those resprouts will form new buds that can sprout when they get killed back. So they stick around. Somewhat of a question how many centuries that would happen, would take to reduce those, but forest inventory data estimates that we still have about 400 million of these sprouts across the eastern United States. About 79 million of them are in Virginia. Most of them are less than a 1 inch diameter. You hike the Blue Ridge Mountains, Shenandoah National Park, particularly. There's sections of the Appalachian trails and many of the side trails that have just hundreds, if not thousands, per mile of trail along the edge of the trail. But they generally don't get much taller than 3 or 4 feet before they're killed back by the blight. But there are occasional large survivors and what we call large survivors or escapes. It's a fast growing tree. So if it happens to be lucky enough to escape the blight for 10 years, it can get up to easily 7-8 inches or even up to 9 or 10 inches. If we see a tree like that, that's up to 7 or 8 inches in diameter and has no blight on it, we're interested in that. But most of the times when we go back and look at those trees again, we find them to be dead from the blight. They've just been lucky. What we prefer to see are more interested in seeing are trees that are that size or larger that have had the blight. We see cankers on them. And they are what we call large survivors. They have shown some evidence that they may have some level of resistance in their genetic makeup, and that they are somehow resisting the blight. So what is required to restore the American chestnut? Well, we need trees, obviously. We need trees that have sufficient resistance to blight and root rot. So we have 2 diseases we actually have to deal with, particularly in the southern part of the range. But and those trees need to have enough resistance. It'd be great if they were totally immune to disease, had no effect on them, but that's probably not something that's going to happen, because even Chinese chestnuts and Japanese chestnuts occasionally they get the blight, they form cankers, and occasionally on a weak tree or a young tree it'll kill them. So it's a disease that is probably we're not gonna achieve immunity from the disease, but we want them to survive long enough to reach canopy and be competitive in growth against other tree species. So we want these to be, active, regenerating, and repopulating trees in a forest situation. So they need to reach up into the canopy. They need to be competitive to do that. They have to be able to compete with tulip poplar and other oaks, or oaks, I should say. And they need to produce chestnuts in sufficient quantities to spread naturally. Fortunately, like acorns, oaks and hickories, they're spread by scatter hoarding by rodents and birds. So you often find the best regeneration of both oaks and hickories, and historically, going back to Henry David Thoreau's observations, the best chestnut seedlings were found away from the heavy chestnut stands and pine stands or other stands, oak stands, that where the rodents and birds, blue jays particularly, would take chestnuts and bury them away from where everybody else was collecting chestnuts. So that's hence the term scatter hoarding. And that was the way they spread through the environment and where they actually had the best natural regeneration from seedlings. The trees that we need for restoring across the range of chestnut need to be as diverse as the original population. We need to, so they can be locally adapted and avoid inbreeding. We've done some analysis, and we have found that across the range, there's at least a northern, central, and southern seed zone where the genetic diversity is to fully capture the genetic diversity and recognize the regional differences. We're probably going to actually subdivide those into two zones for each to get a little finer capture of that diversity. Trees also need to have success in passing on the traits for resistance and fitness. So when you're breeding trees for a trait like blight resistance, you need to identify trees that have that trait, but also can pass it on to their progeny. So that's part of tree breeding people don't typically think about, but when you're selecting for good trees, they need to be both good themselves in resisting the blight, but also be able to pass it on to their children. And we also need, in addition to trees, we need silvicultural methods from planting to maturity that can ensure all of the above, that the trees can survive the blight, be diverse, locally adapted, and they can pass on their traits for resistance and fitness. And we really don't have a good literature in forestry about managing chestnuts because it was gone in the early 1900s. And we've learned a lot since then about managing oaks and hickories, and that's still a challenge. But we don't really know that much about how to manage chestnuts in the forest. So we're going to have to develop those techniques as well: how to plant them, how to manage them while they're growing, how to manage them when they get mature. So what does the American Chestnut Foundation do? Well, we were formed 40 years ago, and there's been actually since the very beginning, since the disease was discovered in 1904, a lot of efforts to try to deal with the blight. There was methods. There were a lot of efforts taken, particularly in Pennsylvania, to try to stop the spread. And they did that by clearing all chestnuts ahead of the spread of the chestnut blight. So probably it didn't work. It probably made things worse by actually getting rid of chestnuts. And they tried breeding. They tried to bring in, see if just Chinese and Japanese varieties could grow in our forest. And they can survive in our forests, but they don't grow. They're not competitive. They're not fit for the environment. They don't grow as fast as other native trees, particularly the oaks and tulip poplars. And so there was some effort to try to find large survivors that could be bred, and within the American species itself, within the dentata species itself, but that was not particularly successful. So about 40 years ago, Charles Burnham, who's a corn breeder, came up with the idea of backcrossing Chinese chestnuts with Americans. Chinese-American hybrids start with a Chinese-American hybrid, so you have a 50-50 Chinese-American genetic makeup, and keep backcrossing it for with American pollen 3 times. So you end up with 3/4, 7/8, and 15/16 populations, and select for blight resistance along the way. And that was part of the effort that the Virginia chapter got involved in 20 some years ago. And we have been planting restoration or backcross, well, a number of things. We have backcross orchards, which are the light green. We have breeding orchards, which are the blue, which are the breeding orchards producing backcross trees. And we have seed orchards, 3 large seed orchards in Northern Virginia, where we're producing backcross progeny for additional selection and eventual possible distribution. We also have what are called GCOs, for germplasm conservation orchards, and we have four of those around the state that have only Americans in them, and we keep them for breeding purposes, and so we can have an end preservation of the diversity of the American population in Virginia. And this is repeated in 16 state chapters up and down the range of the American chestnut. So just in Virginia, well, over the years, we've planted over 36,000 chestnuts. We have about 2,100 surviving in these orchards. And I include in here the orchards in Nelson County, which were the really run by the Virginia Department of Forestry, who I used to work for, and they continue to provide support and continue to, and we've integrated that into the Virginia chapter and the larger national effort of breeding. So Lestane State Forest is a place I recommend that you visit. We may arrange some visits. We periodically arrange tours of there. You can see a lot of the history of chestnut breeding there and a lot of nice chestnut trees. So here are the male catkins flowers I was mentioning before, and here are the smaller, are the lower placed the female flowers. So like little pineapples maybe with these white styles, where we apply the pollen. In addition to the backcross program, some of you may have heard about the efforts at State University of New York, ESF, to put a transgene into chestnuts, and that would confer resistance by taking a gene from wheat, which is also found in a lot of other grains and other fruits like bananas and strawberries, that detoxifies the oxalic acid, which is a common fungal toxin produced by blights generally. And so it was a good idea to see if that transferring that gene from wheat to chestnut would be able to confer resistance. And we do some of that breeding. The gene was inserted into the chestnut genome in the lab at SUNY ESF. And then part of the effort is to diversify that into more and more American parents. So we wouldn't just have one clone or one family. And at Lestane State Forest, we have an APHIS permit, which allows us to do that breeding before that's deregulated. And that's why we have to put these bags around there so the squirrels won't take away transgenic chestnuts while we're trying to have them mature over the season. So genetic improvement. I've already touched on a couple approaches. Traditional breeding, and that is transferring resistance genes from Asian chestnuts, like the backcross program was intended to do. We also want to find resistance genes in wild type American chestnuts. And there's actually been an effort at Lestane State Forest to do that for quite some time. We have a purely American orchard there that has grafts or seedlings of what we call large surviving Americans. And they show a elevated level of resistance. They're not fully resistant, but they are more resistant than the typical wild type American. So we backcross, we can do selective breeding within either the backcrossing or the wild type American chestnuts. and that is now being aided by genomic selection. My experience working with chestnuts breeding over 30 some years, it can really be divided into two periods. The first 20 some years, we were totally blind with what we were doing. We were doing control crosses, but we didn't always know what genes we were selecting for. In fact, we did not know what genes we were selecting for. In fact, we naively thought there were only 2 or 3 genes that could confer resistance. And it turns out with the ability to do genotyping, to sequence genes in chestnuts, we've learned a lot more. And that's really been happening the last 10 or 15 years. And it's getting cheaper and cheaper. So we can sequence not every tree we deal with, but a large numbers. We have a database of many thousands of trees that have been sequenced, and that allows us to look at what's going on in our backcross and selective breeding programs. And that information we can use to make our breeding more directed and more selective. And that is what's meant by aided by genomic selection. So we do traditional breeding, but we have the progeny, the parents and the progeny genetically sequenced, and we can look for markers, look for genes that may confer resistance. So that's one approach, traditional breeding, now aided by genomic selection. And the other one is bioengineering, insertion of genes from unrelated species is what we've tried so far. And that is the Darling 58 tree from the one being under review right now is the Darling 58 from SUNY Environmental Sciences and Forestry School, ESF. And that gene is called the OXO gene, oxalic acid oxidate, because it produces an enzyme which detoxifies the oxalic acid that the chestnut blight produces. And we also are looking for further transfer of genes. And maybe one good place is to identify what are called cis genes, or look for genes from cisgenic species. Those, in our case, those are trees that can breed, or closely related, and in our case, can breed with American chestnuts. So the Chinese and Japanese chestnuts particularly are good cis genes, cisgenic species to look at. Because what we're finding from our genetic studies is that blight resistance is a polygenic. There's lots of genes involved in, at least in the Chinese and Japanese, in conferring resistance. It's not just one gene. So we may be soon introducing genes into dentata, the American chestnut, using genes from other Castanea species. And that may allow us to build up a whole suite of genes which can confer resistance on the level of the Asian resistance. So the progress in the breeding, we are at the third backcross has been completed, and they exhibited a wide range of resistance from poor to pretty good. We had hoped that we had designed the backcross breeding program on the assumption, which seemed reasonable at the time, that there were maybe 3 genes involved. And we designed it to be a scale that, half or more of the trees should have pretty good resistance. What we found is that only maybe 10 or 20% have pretty good resistance. And so we can keep working with that for further breeding and genomic selection to try to get a larger population that may have resistance up to. We use a simple scale that's somewhat quantitative, somewhat qualitative, of 0 to 100 for blight resistance, 0 being the wild type American and 100 being Chinese chestnuts. And we put these as Chinese and Americans in our test as controls. And, we have a range in the backcross that ranges from about 20 to 80% of the resistance of the Chinese. And I think we can get that average up higher. Darling 58, the tree, the gene was successfully moved into wheat, from wheat into chestnut. It's in the testing and regulatory process. And I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the regulatory process, but the word is still out, about whether this will be successful in conferring resistance at the level we need. It's promising, but there are concerns, and I think one source of confusion is it's close to being approved for release by APHIS, Agricultural Plant Health Inspection Service, hopefully soon. But they are only going to certify that it is safe. They don't certify that it is effective. And we still need tests to make sure that we find it to be effective enough. And then other progress in breeding is looking for additional genes, as I mentioned. And we understand that multiple genes are involved in at least the natural resistance in Chinese and Japanese. And it's a complex biological process. So how do we test for restoration suitability? We do greenhouse and orchard tests, and we're pretty good at doing that. We have the protocols down to assess the effectiveness of the resistance, potential side effects. We also, and this is, kind of down in the weeds of tree breeding or any kind of breeding, but we need other tests, typically in the greenhouse and orchards, to test the expression of our genes and the heritability of the gene. So what that means is you can have a gene that confers resistance, but you need for it to be well behaved, maybe a way of saying it, to be expressed when it needs to be expressed and not have any side effects. So, and that can change over time. So we're looking for what's called gene silencing. You may have a gene, but if it gets turned off or not turned on by the plant, it doesn't confer resistance. We also know with genes that at different stages of the life of the plant, they may confer different levels of resistance. So we're looking for, is there gene silencing going on? Is the resistance durable? And unfortunately, with long-lived plants like trees, you really won't have an answer for possibly decades or even longer to these ultimate questions. We also need to test the trees out in the forest to both look at resistance in the field. So they may perform well in greenhouse and orchard tests, but will they perform as well in the field? And also what we call fitness, just largely, are they fit for the environment? Are they prime consideration, are they competitive in that environment? Will they compete with other trees? And both with different genotypes and different environments. So we may have some sources, some strains or varieties of chestnuts that do well in the south versus do poorly in the north, or vice versa, on dry sites versus wet sites, and so on. We also need that forest testing to validate the gene and the trait are safe to the tree and the environment, and that the trait is effective and durable. So that's going to take many years. I guess one of the main points I want you to take away from there is that, there's saying we've reached the successful restoration of American chestnut, or even that we have a tree that is suited for restoration, is going to take a long time. We have some good candidates, but we cannot definitively say that we have the magic bullet that's going to restore the chestnut for many decades. So how does government regulation fit into this? There's, in my view anyway, there's a little bit of mismatch between coming up with a tree that is ready for restoration and what the government regulation process does. So the USDA APHIS, Agricultural Plant Health Inspection Service, when they approve or deregulate a tree, it just deems that the tree poses no plant health risk. It's not going to be invasive. It's not going to be detriment to other plants or itself. EPA is involved as well. That's the next phase of regulation. They just certify or deem that the tree poses no public health or environmental risk to the environment or endangered species. And then the FDA approval deems that chestnuts are safe to eat. That's probably going to be the the easiest hurdle to pass because they really are no different than regular American chestnuts or Chinese chestnuts, except for the OXO gene, which you have probably eaten today. If you had any wheat products, if you had bananas, if you had strawberries, and many other foods, you've probably already eaten OXO today, OXO. But no agency judges whether the trait is effective in conferring resistance, has genetic fitness, nor that the trait is heritable and durable. And we only will do that by our testing. It'll only be proved by our testing in the years and decades to come. So we do intend to move into restoration testing and trials. This will allow us to more easily diversify the OXO gene into all our seed zones, also allow us to progress the traditional breeding as well. And regulatory approval will allow us to test OXO along with other sources of resistance for level of resistance, genetic fitness, stability, heritability, and desirability of traits. These restoration trials have been going on. We started them on small scale with the backcross trees, and there's one in Virginia that we just measured this past year. It's a 12-year-old test down near Mountain Lake, Johns Creek Mountain. And these are 12-year-old trees. Of course, this is the tallest and nicest looking tree. It's about 30 feet tall, but the trees that survived the blight well and grew well on average are about 20 to 25 feet tall, up to 30. And they started producing burrs the last couple of years, which the bears have discovered. And so they are climbing the trees and unfortunately tearing apart some of the canopies to get at the burrs. But this is a qualified success using backcross trees. We have been able to create a closed stand of trees where they are dominant and starting to fruit. But the blight has killed close to half of the trees in those 12 years and will probably continue to kill additional trees. You can see a canker at this branch crotch right here. So it's not totally resistant, but enough to get about 50% survival, which isn't bad for a hardwood planting, even without the blight, and get into the canopy. But there's many challenges in planting trees out in the wild. So let's see. There's deer browse, this was an area they were protected from browse by tubes for a few years. It's not a heavy, it's in an area national forest that is hunted, and it wasn't a particularly bad deer browse. Many of the other tests that we planted were failures, not because of blight, but because of deer browse. As you saw, we have some bear damage. There was competing vegetation, particularly tulip trees and sprouts from the oaks and maples, and they were controlled for several years. We had people going in there and cutting the back and applying herbicides on the sprouts. There's a question about what are the best light conditions to plant chestnuts. Do you want to plant them in small gaps, larger gaps, or bigger cuttings like shelterwood cuttings that leave only a small number of trees in the overstory? You have to deal with invasive species. In our tests, the biggest problems we've run into on the sites we have been autumn olive and oriental bittersweet. And the bittersweet can grow quite fast on them, and you need to keep those vines off of them as best as you can. There's also just general barriers to natural regeneration. Once the trees start producing, there's going to be a lot of things trying to eat them. They produce a lot of chestnuts, but only a few ever end up as seedlings. And you need to possibly manage the shade levels in the stands to help seedlings develop. And we may need to decide or find out if fire can be helpful. So is fire suppression allowing the more shade tolerant trees to outcompete? Fire might be a way to promote chestnuts, like it's being explored as a way to promote oak. We also need to develop standards for seedlings to be planted and the best silvicultural practices, from site preparation, competition control, deer management, intermediate releases and thinnings, and promotion of natural regeneration. So we get a lot of questions about people want chestnut trees, and I totally get that. So there are some places you can get trees. So the Virginia Department of Forestry has its annual seedling sales, and they open up in October of every year. And not too surprisingly, I suppose, the chestnuts get sold out pretty quickly. So they've traditionally offered Chinese chestnuts, but in the last few years, they've offered backcross hybrids collected from that Lasagne State Forest that I've showed pictures of, and also Americans collected from that same forest, from that large surviving American orchard. So we actually just sowed next year's crop that will be available for sale next October. This year's crop that's sold out, is delivered typically in the spring, 2024 in this case. But I would encourage you to, if you're interested in some trees, particularly in more quantities, this is a great place to get them. And we don't give any, neither Department of Forestry or Chestnut Foundation gives any guarantees on these, but the backcross hybrids, have the potential to perform as well as that test I showed you. The Americans, probably not, they're going to be more American and maybe some level of resistance, but not nearly as much as the backcross hybrids. And then, of course, if you just want a yard tree, Chinese is a perfectly nice tree, and it produces nuts, and they're good to eat. Backcross hybrids, you can be fairly successful with those. Some are going to die from the blight. We actually have our experience with people. Our experience has been that most people growing them, if they die, they typically die either because of too wet soil, compacted soil, just poor planting. And then if they die from blight, they generally die a number of years later. So most of the mortality really is just poor planting and management of the trees. But they will get the blight. And whether they survive it for a long period or not is an open question. The American Chestnut Foundation also offers seedling sales that they open up in March and deliver shortly thereafterwards. So those are only for wild type trees, American trees. With different levels of membership, you can get backcross trees, the latest backcross trees. And couple of points. I recommend getting Virginia sources, particularly if you want to breed them in the future, or at least some other southern sources. I know you can get them from New York and Ohio and Indiana and other places, and they may be perfectly fine for a yard tree, but they're not going to be as adapted to the local environment. No current sources are highly blight resistant except for the Chinese, and the Darling 58 trees are going to be regulated. And I went through that complicated process of 3 agencies. And during the EPA regulation period, they are limited in distribution to so many acres and so many locations. And there's probably going to be very few available to the public in that period. And it's hard to say what, in theory, that EPA regulation could be as few as 2 or 3 years. But like any government program, it's probably going to take longer. So we're kind of trying to let people know that the Darling 58s will probably not be available for broad distribution, at least for 4 to 7 more years. If you plant trees, expect blight. If you're in the coastal plain or Piedmont, or even some places in the mountains, root rot is a real possibility. You can get a soil test for the Phytophthora to see if it's there. And that will tell you if it's there at the time you plant it. It won't tell you if it's going to come in later or come up from, or just at levels that are not detectable. The good, if their chestnuts are already growing there as sprouts, that's probably a good indication that there's not Phytophthora. But otherwise, stay away from wet soils, compacted soils, heavily agricultural soils that have been in agricultural use for a long time, because that's how Phytophthora is moved around, generally by heavy equipment going from field to field. And then, you'd be prepared to deal with the deer. But be open for success. I mean, there's quite a few examples of chestnuts, either Americans or more often the backcross hybrids that have been planted for 10 or 15 years that are doing quite well. So how can you help? So we certainly encourage you to support our Virginia chapter and the national effort in general. Become a member, support our efforts financially, volunteer. So we are looking for volunteers. I think one thing kind of unique about the American Chestnut Foundation work is that it's very specialized. We need people who are willing to put in time to learn how to do tree pollinations, learn how to do controlled plantings in seed orchards, work in our greenhouse. And so it's not just, we do on occasion when we do have a big planting, we need a big group of people, or only harvest the chestnuts. We need a big group of people to help open up the burrs, and we usually get good volunteers. But we really need people who are willing to spend, a reasonable amount of time developing some skills and working on basically a science project. And if want a little bit lower level, or in addition, you can help us find trees. And we have an app called Tree Snap, which is actually designed for a lot of trees at risk, that you can download off of Apple or Android, that allows you to snap a photo, get a location for a chestnut tree that you find in the wild. And what differentiates this from something like iNaturalist is that it asks the kind of questions that we need to know about the tree to help see if it's something worthwhile to go look at. So if you're out hiking and find trees, I encourage you to get this app and report those trees, and we can find out about it as soon as you upload it. And it works offline as well. You don't have to be connected to the internet or cellular service for it to work. And then, certainly we encourage people to plant more chestnut trees. As I mentioned, seed memberships, the Buy Virginia Trees. We have relied on landowners to provide us sites for orchards. And if that's something you're interested in, if you have a site that you're willing to invest into a chestnut orchard, at the moment, we're kind of in between. We don't have a great need for orchards right now, but that's may change fairly soon. So if it's a long-term interest of you, let us know, because maybe we can put an orchard on your land if it's the right kind of land and it can serve us a purpose. You can visit us at tacf.org/Virginia to get to the chapter itself. There's also our email, vachestnut@gmail.com. So I'll also mention a couple upcoming events. We'll having our chapter general membership meeting November 11th at Banshee Reeks Nature Reserve up near Leesburg. We have one of our seed orchards up there. So if you want to see what the seed orchards with several thousand little chestnut trees in those and how it's designed and where those trees came from, we'll have that on the tour about how we do that. Also, we have a professionally made documentary about chestnuts that will be screened after the chestnut tour. And then we collected this year, a total of over 12,000 chestnuts. The great majority of them are designed for scientific tests or restoration trials, but we do have a few hundred extra. And so rather than throw them away or eat them, we're going to give them away to members that show up and might want a handful. We haven't decided how many. It'll be at least 5 or 6, maybe a dozen chestnuts that'll just be in little baggies with peat moss, ready for you to germinate and grow on your own if you're interested. We also, if you're not, if you're more central Virginia area, we are going to have a in-person screening of the documentary again at the Ivy Creek Natural Area, at the education building there in Charlottesville at Ivy Creek Natural Area. And you can sign up for that either through the Ivy Creek website or this donor view link. I got through pretty quick. Do we have hopefully we have some questions, I guess, if we're ready for that.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions, John. So that was a wonderful presentation, and really appreciate all that jam-packed information and bringing us up to speed on all the research that's done around the American chestnut, and lots of hearts and claps of appreciation from the audience. So thank you very much. So I think we'll get started with just some questions about kind of the basics around American chestnut. So David asked, how old do the chestnuts get? Or maybe historically, how old? Because right now they're dying before they get too terribly old.
Yeah, very good question. I guess we don't have good data on that, but they probably grew as old as oaks and hickories and other trees. And so, easily 150, 200 years, probably up to 300 and more.
Wow, that's amazing. I know some of the old photos of the trees that had been felled, unfortunately, are just massive. So examples of very old trees. We have a question from Emily. What is the difference between the American chestnut leaf and a chinkapin oak leaf? Could you kind of talk about some of the finer points of how to differentiate the two?
So chinkapin oak, it does not have that curved kind of breaking wave. It's also coarser, and that's hard to, that's more of a comparison, and not as green. But there's also chinkapins, which are also Castanea species, and they are smaller leaves, and they are hairy underneath. So one of the actually very distinguishing characteristics of American is that they have no leaves, no hairs on the underside of on the leaf blade on the underside. With a hand lens, you can find some long, thin hairs along the midrib that are kind of sparse. The Chinese, Japanese, and the chinkapins all have hairy undersides of their leaves. And so that is, if you turn the leaf over and it feels kind of woolly or hairy or kind of white, looks kind of white from the hairs, then that is good indication it's not an American. And then of course chinkapin oaks have acorns rather than burrs if you happen to have those. So.
Okay, I'm sure that Emily must have been referring to the chinkapin and not chinkapin oak. I assumed it was chinkapin oak, not realizing that there was another species out there. So yeah. Great question. Thank you, Emily. And we did have a question about, you had mentioned that the chestnuts, that they are shade tolerant and they need full sun. Could you clarify that a bit more?
Well,
I had a question about that.
Sure. Yeah, so that's a little complex. So they can survive and thrive in the shade, but they don't grow tall. They put their resources into building up their root systems and building up energy stores in their root systems. And then when they are opened up to the sun, they're able to respond quickly and grow fast. So other shade tolerant trees, say like sugar maple, they'll grow probably better in height in the shade, but they won't respond as quickly to being opened up to the sun. So it's a little different strategy. It's actually a very effective strategy because when they have no canopy space to get into, they don't bother putting on height growth. They put their resources into building up their energy stores and their roots. And then then they can take advantage of that opening to spurt up.
Okay, thanks for that. And we had a couple questions about how the blight has spread, and I'm sorry if you touched on that in your presentation. I was trying to manage the Q&A. How did the blight spread once it was found in the United States?
Yeah, so like a lot of fungi, it has both airborne and waterborne spores. So you can see on blight, I don't think I had a picture in the slideshow, but you get little orange fruiting bodies on the bark called conidia that can put out spores that can be airborne. But probably the most effective way it's spread is those waterborne spores, which can be sticky. So animals can get those, birds and animals can get those on their feet and or fur or feathers or whatever, and spread them from tree to tree. So it's spread pretty easily. Certainly where there's lots of chestnuts, you can get a real population explosion. And a lot of times we see areas that have been clear cut or burned, you get a lot of sprouting. And when there's a lot of sprouting, you have a lot more bark surface, and the blight population can actually also take off and kill a lot of those sprouts. But unfortunately, it just spreads from oak tree to oak tree without damaging the oak tree, but it's around. So
okay. Let's see. Okay, great question. And I'm just kind of looking through to what some of the other new questions that may have come in. So let's talk about some of we have a great question from Judy about climate change. And what impact do you think climate change will have on the long-term chestnut restoration program? How does climate change fit into the work that's being done?
Yeah, we definitely need to think about that when we prioritize restoration plantings. I mean, one good thing about it, especially if you look back at the pollen record, it's been since the last ice age. It's been all over the eastern United States, and it followed it followed the retreat of the glaciers up into New England. I mean, it's somewhat delayed, but it did get all the way. And it was, originally it's always been dominant in the southern Appalachians, but it used to be down in the coastal plain, even in the Gulf of Mexico when the sea levels were lower. So I guess the short answer there, though, is it's very plastic. It has the genetic diversity that it can survive in fairly warm to cold climates. It's probably most limited by cold, so it didn't get too far north into Canada in the future. But with climate change, we expect to be able to move north, and it looks a little bit more northern right now, or historically, because of Phytophthora root rot. So I think it'll still be adapted to a wide range, but where it'll do the best will probably change due to climate change.
Okay. And we have a few questions about just the breeding programs and the Darling 58 trees that we'll ask next. And there were some questions from our audience about planting the hybridized chestnuts, and can that affect chestnut trees and woods and forests that may be hanging on, and we just don't know, or maybe they're old enough to reproduce. What are there concerns around that? Or is it really an issue because there aren't any chestnuts out there?
No, there's chestnuts. There's okay. Over 70 million in Virginia, and not many. Probably a few, certainly several hundred, maybe a few thousand that occasionally bloom. Although producing fertile nuts is a challenge because they don't self-pollinate, so you have to have at least two trees nearby. So the hybrid trees, when you get to 15, I guess one way of answering that, when the backcross trees, when you get to 15, 16s, they are phenotypically, so it's hard to tell them. It's almost impossible to tell them apart without looking for a few remnant hairs on the underside of the leaves to indicate there's some Asian ancestry in them. And they seem to perform as well as Americans. And in fact, I mean, where they've been tested, they perform better than Americans because the Americans are more likely to get the blight. So I personally, I think they would fill exactly the same ecological niche as Americans did, and they're not any more competitive, and I could be hard pressed to tell much difference. And and when we get to that, it's not really too surprising because some of the we say 15, 16s, but in that backcross generation, the proportion American genes will be anywhere from 92 to 99 point something percent. There's variation. They're not all exactly 15, 16s. And so at that point, it's it depends on how you define purity, I suppose. It's most people of Eurasian ancestry have 1 or 2% Neanderthal, so they're about the same at that level. I think they're more than American enough. And I guess you could also raise that question about the transgenic. I mean, then it's just one gene, or just maybe if we end up adding a couple genes. So it's very, very, very slightly different. So.
Okay. And we did have a question from Laura about the controversy over the Darling 58. Has that died down, or is it still a contentious issue? And Laura remarked it's been portrayed in past social media as a big conflict, at least philosophically.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's gone away. There was a period of open comment for the APHIS approval of or deregulation of Darling 58, and it certainly came up then. I suspect after approval or deregulation, as it's called, it'll resurface, I think there will be a period where it's still being field tested and not widely distributed. So hopefully that can answer some of those questions during that period. But I think there'll always be people who are just against it on principle. So.
Mm-hmm. And that leads me to a follow-up, maybe a clarification question about some of the regulatory processes and like the Department of Forestry and the American Chestnut Foundation. They're giving away seeds, trees. Have those been approved? Are those not regulated, like the genetically modified? Because there was a question like, how are we getting trees if they haven't been approved by APHIS? So I wondered if you could kind of explain how that's different.
Right. So traditional breeding using backcross methods or hybridization methods is not regulated at all. So there's no restriction. It's just like planting out Chinese or Japanese trees is allowed anywhere anybody wants to do that. So I mean, I guess that's the short answer. So it's perfectly allowed. And there's even questions going forward about things if people are familiar with CRISPR, where you're not using foreign genes, you're either creating new genes or there's even questions about whether that technique will be as heavily regulated as the transgenes methods that we've used so far. So that's a whole larger issue. I think there's a real, as I pointed out, the system is really, the current regulatory system is all about protecting against risk. It's not designed like a drug test would be to test for effectiveness. So, that was one of the points I wanted to get across. 'Cause I think a lot of people were, expecting the Darling 58 to be approved in a sense very shortly. And that's the solution. It could be, hopefully it is, hopefully it's part of the solution at least. But it's not proved 100% effective yet until we have long-term field trials.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. That was very helpful. And I think we're running up against 12:56. So I think I will ask you one more question. Well, first, I would just like to note we had a lot of questions from our audience. They wanted to know how to get chestnut seeds, chestnut seedlings, and so you provided that great slide that told people how to get that plant material. And I dropped those links into the Q&A box and as well as the chat box. So that information is there, but you can go to the American Chestnut Foundation website or the Virginia Department of Forestry website and search from both of those places. So the last question, and I thought this was a really interesting question from Benjamin. Benjamin said, I've heard that passenger pigeons were effectively a companion species to chestnut trees, and without them, it's unlikely that chestnuts can ever come close to the distribution once realized. Can you comment on this?
Yes, I've heard that. I think their main role was long distance dispersal. So I'm not sure that they were that important for, from stand to stand in a local area, because they would tend to mob an area and eat a lot of chestnuts and then fly off somewhere. And, if the way it would work is that they would probably have to die or be killed or something like that before they fully digested the chestnut and they could establish a chestnut somewhere far away. So we can easily do that. we can plant these elsewhere in lieu of the passenger pigeons. It'd be great if the passenger pigeons could do it for us, but I don't think that's required for us to get long distance dispersal.
Okay, great question. And then last question from Renee. Any book recommendations about the history or ecology of the American chestnut?
So Susan Frankel's The American Chestnut, A Perfect Tree is the best book that's I've ever, for the general public anyway, that I've ever read about chestnut. It's a little bit dated, and it just mentions the transgenic trees a little bit, but it's still a very good overview. Don Davis has a book out called American Chestnut, an Environmental History, I believe it's called. And that goes into much more scholarly depth and with lots of references on the environmental history. I would say it's kind of weak on the science side of things, but it doesn't really pretend to be that. It's much more the environmental history. But that's a kind of dense book. If you like reading really dense environmental history, that's a great one. But I think for the general public, Susan Frankel's book is a lot more readable.
Okay, well, we'll treat that as our final question today. And thank you, Rowena, for dropping the name of one of those books in the chat. So at this point, I'm going to hand it back off to Rowena to close us out today.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, John. That was fascinating. I know a lot of people really appreciated you telling us about the chestnut and answering a lot of those questions. Beth, do you want to share your slides, or should we just?
Yeah, I'm pulling up that last slide. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Just running a little behind. Okay.
There
we go.
We are all running a little behind today. We thank you if you're still with us. I know it's 1 o'clock, and we just wanted to say one thing before I get to this slide is that the chestnut seedlings that we are giving away for free in our drawing are the 15/16 chestnut seedlings that were grown on Middle Mountain Farm in Free Union in Western Albemarle County, Virginia. So John already spoke about that, and those are the kinds that we are giving away today in the drawing. But moving on, I just want to let you know if you have any more questions about Blue Ridge PRISM, on this slide, you'll see that we have our website, and if you would like to support our work, as Beth so eloquently said, please consider donating to us. We appreciate any amount and are really, truly grateful. You can also follow us on social media to keep up with us, future presentations and what we're doing. If you have any additional questions after today, feel free to email us at info@blueridgeprism.org. And finally, we are really focusing this year on building our volunteer program and our area steward program. And we have a form that you can fill out on our website to volunteer, so we can call on you when the need arises. So please consider that too. Here is the link on this slide, and you can also find it on our website. Other than that, thank you so much, John. We really appreciated you being with us, and thank you all, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.